All right, Mike's going to tell us about UV and
More generally,
packaging and project.
more generally the project and package management and UV at the end.
As the conclusion, is it?
Kind of, yeah, exactly. Well, thank you.
Sorry.
Thanks, Danny.
Spoiler.
Thanks, Danny. So yes, so as mentioned, I was just going to go through a bit of Python project and package management and some of the software associated with it. And part of the process, this is something I wanted to learn about, which is kind of why I wanted to do the talk itself. I had started using UV, I really liked it, and I'm like, well, probably be good for other people to know, and I want to learn a bit of the history on it. And since I want to learn a bit of the history, I'm going to actually go into the history of all that kind of stuff. So people here that have actually been using Python for much longer than me, I've only actually been using Python since 2016. So anybody wants to actually chime in with any kind of additions or clarify things of the history of certain things, I would appreciate it, because there is a lot of history on this stuff. But first, question is, why do I need to manage my Python projects? Well, there's usually a good XKCD for that. And this is the reason why you need to manage your Python projects and package management. And this is kind of representative of, I feel like, the early to mid 2010s when it was fairly chaotic, which I feel like is the reputation of somehow Python has gotten, of like crazy chaotic package managers, which kind of, I feel like from that time, and it hasn't somehow, reputation hasn't gone away yet. But as you'll see later, you don't have to worry, because the package management now is much, much better. So as I said, I like history, and I read a bunch about the history of the Python packaging. So I figured I'd start with that. In the beginning, there was Python 1, 1994. And initially for a while, just like the old-ish languages, I wouldn't call it that old. I mean, maybe actually just, never mind. I think I'm actually old compared to this audience, but nevertheless, it's an oldish language. So initially for a while, people just, if you wanted to share code and packages, you just sent a Python file and put it in your Python path, and that was all you had. But near the end of the century, people were like, maybe we should make this easier for people to share code. Maybe we should standardize things a little bit more. And so they created distutils, and they put it in the standard library, as everything was just in the standard library from the beginning. Our modern concept of so many third-party packages of things is really relatively modern compared to back in the day. And so that made things easier, so people could make packages easier, and that kind of coincided with Python 2 as well. People could make packages, and they could kind of share packages, and at a certain point, they standardized the kind of the metadata in the setup.py file, which people probably familiar with, and that started with distutils, and that's what it used for the packaging of Python modules into things that people could actually share and then put in their Python path and do things they want to do with it. And so as people were making more and more of these packages and sharing them, there was an idea fairly early on, it seems like, that they probably want a kind of a global index of all the different packages that have existed that people were publishing. And they created the Python packaging index. Yes?
Which was called the cheese shop first, right?
Cheese shop, yes, correct. Yes, I did read about that. Which I think a lot of the early people preferred that name, but somehow it got deprecated because people aren't fun. I don't know. But yes. But the early PyP was just like an index of a bunch of packages that people could search, and then they'd have to click on it and download it and then use the distutils they installed into their. It wasn't like it is today where you just go pip install blah 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 and it just automatically does everything for you. It was much more manual of a process. And then a year later, a guy, I forget the name of the guy, but he created setup tools to kind of extend distutils to make it easier, more things you could build packages with, easier to install things with. But this was built outside of the standard package, outside of Python itself, not in the standard library, which is kind of strange and weird. And in hindsight, of course, they should have brought it into it long before. But setup utils is still the main way that people package up Python packages and move them around. And that had started in 2004. And that had continued to develop gradually over time and eventually supplant distutils as the thing that you package things up with. And now, between 2004 and 2007, people were actually creating a bunch of packages, and they were using a bunch of packages outside of the standard library. And at a certain point, people were like, well, I've got projects, and I need to use certain packages for one project, but not other projects. Because before this, you just had one installation of Python, and you just installed everything associated with that. But if you had two different projects and you wanted two different sets of packages, you couldn't do it. So in 2007, they created this virtual env package that allowed you to actually have virtual environments of different Python kind of sets of packages for different Python environments for different projects, which is great. So you can, separate things a little bit easier. You still had to have a one operating system level kind of Python executable, but at least you could have separate setups of your different third-party packages. And I think primarily up until this point, correct me if I'm wrong, Python was primarily developed by Linux users for Linux users. So that's all is all related to Linux-related stuff. And then afterwards, in 2008, pip was developed. Pip was in similar API as it is now, to where it makes it much more easy to install packages into your virtual env. I don't know if they were able to, at that time, be able to do it via Pipey or not, but probably just made it easier. I don't know if you know.
Yes.
They were, okay.
That was one of the
Key things, right. Makes sense. But I do want to emphasize that unlike the modern package installation stuff nowadays, it didn't have dependency conflict resolvers in it. It actually came much, much later. So if you had a bunch of packages you want to install, and one package and two packages had the same package, but two different versions. One package required the same thing of less than version 1, and the other one required something that was greater than version 1. Pip would just happily install presumably the last one that was on the list of things. It would just overwrite it. No conflict resolution. Probably at that point the packages weren't so complicated, things weren't too complicated to where it probably wasn't that big of a deal. But none of that happened, and nothing that didn't get fixed until much, much later. Later on, they didn't like the idea of using a Python script as a configuration file, so they decided that maybe we should have a setup.cfg file to kind of replace it as an explicit configuration file. I don't know how well that got picked up, because setup tools still requires the setup.py file, but that came along. Someone somehow gotten in there. And so around 2012, maybe somebody could correct me with this, the Python Packaging Authority, kind of the official Python group that manages a lot of stuff, kind of took over setup tools, because again, setup tools slowly became the more predominant, supplanted dist tools in terms of building Python packages, and it was built by one guy, and that seemed to kind of, not so good. PyEnv came along. PyEnv, and I'm sure there was other things probably before that as well, but I'm just not familiar with it because I'm not that familiar with this stuff. But this is something to where, as I mentioned before, virtual env allows you to have virtual environments for your third-party packages, but you still had to rely on the same Python single Python executable of a single version, PyEnv lets you install multiple different Python versions in case you needed to work across projects that actually use different Python versions. So that solved another problem. And Conda came along. I'm guessing most people are familiar with Conda. They are completely separate from most of the other official Python stuff, but they created a stack via one API that did several things. It did the PyEnv of allowing you to install multiple different versions of Python. It created virtual environments for your different projects, and it actually had a full package dependency conflict resolver, blah 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 stuff. So it actually in one system had all of these three things. And I'm not familiar with if there was one thing at that time that did that in the normal official Python community, but it didn't seem like it. You had to piecemeal a bunch of things together, which is kind of traditional, but that did it all. And that's actually what I had started with in 2016, because I'm a scientist. So, that's a data science thing for some reason. It had started up that way. And still in that time, there weren't too good of standards. And there's still a lot of things, as I had mentioned, officially in Python that were just quite complicated, as seen from the XKCD. In 2016, officially, Python created a new standard for their configuration file called a PyProject TOML, which was meant to replace the setup CFG and to become more for metadata for, as it's implied, more project metadata in addition to your package metadata. So it was meant to cover a whole lot of things, which was good and like long needed in the community. And I think they were taken from other bit more modern languages that had kind of figured that out as well before. And then one of the newest, so after that, in 2018, this comes to the more modern Python project and package management tools. Poetry came along, again, one of the earliest ones to have the kind of modern package management stuff. And they decided to kind of use the PyProject TOML kind of as their own, as the way that they, for their configuration, which was great that they had used that. So it was, since the PyProject TOML standard was extendable, they just added their own configuration file onto that, which is good. Then in 2020, they extended all they officially extended all the standards for the PyProject TOML stuff to where it became much more usable and had more or less everything people needed. Pip actually got a dependency resolver that dealt with conflicts, which is surprising it took that long for them to do that. And another package management tool came along called PDM, which is a bit more close to the PyProject standards, which is great, than Poetry. Poetry is pretty good, but a bit more loose. PDM is quite more strict, let's say, to those standards. And then after that, so the Python Packaging Authority decided to create two projects, Hatch and Hatchling. Hatch is just kind of like PDM. And since it's by the Python Packaging Authority, it's very strict to the standards, sometimes like super strict to the point to where like they're not going to do anything more until they get the PEP standard signed and done. And Hatchling, which is meant as a replacement for setup tools, essentially. It's a build system to build Python packages, which is great that they're finally getting around to do that. And then a couple years later, you have UV, which again is the newest iteration of these, which also follows quite closely the PyProject TOML standards, which is great. And it's also written in Rust, which means it's shockingly fast. So I just wanted to, so I've said a bunch of things related to what's needed in along the way in that history of what's needed for in a tool, but I'll just be explicit about it. So we need to be able to manage and install multiple different Python executables on your operating system, so that, because multiple projects may actually require, Python 3.10 and Python 3.11, but you need to be able to install and manage those things. You need to manage and install third-party packages, as described before, like pip and that kind of stuff. Those Python environments need to be isolated. You need to have different ones for each different project, because each project may have completely different dependencies and requirements. You might also need to be able to have different dependencies for your development environment and your testing environment than you just need to run the code by itself. So you'll want to separate, like, these are the dependencies to run your code, and then these are the extra dependencies for what you're developing in, because we're constantly developing, of course, and we'll have a whole lot of different things for linting and other things that doesn't need to be used for running code, but for our development, it definitely is. And of course, we need something to manage our project metadata. And for some of us, we also need a way to be able to build and publish Python packages. Those are kind of the fundamentals, at least, of the things that we would need. Sure, there are other things, but yeah, those are the things the basic stuff. And so this is just like a list of the tasks and what each one of those different pieces of software I had just described does, and tick box next to it. Again, the PyEnv just manages the Python executables, pip, the Python dependencies, virtual env, the isolated environments, and then later there came pipenv, which essentially just combines the three of those into one thing, which is fairly convenient. Conda, which also does those three things, but in a completely separate world. It doesn't follow any of the official standards of anything. Poetry and Hatch, which does everything but manage your Python executables. And PDM and UV, that just simply do everything, except the UV is just shockingly fast. I'm sure there are a bunch of others, but kind of some of the main points. After this, I'll show you a little bit of UV and that kind of stuff. Not too much. There's nothing too complicated about them. And the point being that a lot of these, Poetry, Hash, PDM, UV, they're all moving towards like the same basic sets of functions that they do and the same basic APIs of how you interact with it, which is great, because prior to that there's a lot of differences. And the other key point is that PyProject TOML standard. They've really set up with a good standard, and regardless of which of these pieces of software you use, you should just make sure that they follow the PyProject TOML standards, because I'm sure UV is currently the latest and fanciest version, but who knows? There could be a new one that comes up, but you just got to make sure that as long as you're using that PyProject TOML and the standards associated with it, switching from one to the other should be nearly trivial. But I went from Hatch to UV somewhat recently, and that was super easy. Like it's really straightforward and really similar APIs to work with, and you barely have to change the PyProject TOML at all. But before that, I went from Conda to Hatch, and that was not easy, because the standards and the methods of how things work in the API was completely different. So as long as you stick with the PyProject TOML standard, you should be pretty good, regardless of whatever the flavor of the month of these things would be. So I will show a little bit. Does anybody have any questions before I show off some of the UV stuff, or addendums from some of the people that are familiar with the history of these kinds of things?
There's one thing that I would tack on to the end of that history, which is just a couple days ago, the Python Steering Committee approved sort of an official lock file format. So before too long, tools like Poetry and UV, and a lot of the ones that pin dependencies, will be able to interoperate better. You might be able to use a package built with Poetry with UV a lot easier, because not a package, but like a project built that way, because there will be they'll probably all move to the agreed upon standard now, which is a neat touch.
Yeah,
A
at
neat
least
transition.
the good ones will anyway. And that's what you want to follow with. But yeah, that's good that they're even standardizing that. Go ahead.
I think maybe one thing just to say is that the kind of chaos in the XKCD cartoon, a lot of it's just sort of a symptom of the language's success, because Python sort of ships like it ships on an Apple computer. It's the customization tool for lots and lots of like Blender and Inkscape and like lots of successful software. So you know, within 6 weeks of owning a computer, you've probably got 5 versions of Python on it already, and the last thing you need is another 4 as you start developing stuff. So the chaos has a lot to do with that.
Yeah. Well, to the history, actually, I want to say something to that. Just quickly, before the cheese shop, there was the Vaults of Parnassus.
I didn't
It was
read
just like a website, just a link list
I didn't read
for
about that.
downloading.
The vault of what?
The Vaults of Parnassus. And
Which is-
there was
must be
also
the
one
one
thing you
with
didn't
the
mention from the early days was easy install.
Well, I had it in.
Yeah,
I had it in.
I can't remember.
I had it over here, but that was part.
Oh yeah,
From
with
what
the
I
Z,
understood, it's
with the
part-
Z. Because to use it, you have to download.
Oh,
So it had that catch-22 of easily installing something without having the easily installer.
Right, that's true because
Yeah,
it
so
because
there
it
was
wasn't
this-
part of the standard
Once you
library.
Download
That's the point.
yourself and run yourself to install yourself
Right.
to make yourself available.
Right.
But regarding this chaos, I think that so in Python there was for a very long time a BDFL, Benevolent Dictator for Life, and it was always very important that while any decisions on the language itself would be, if there was a dispute, then that would be resolved basically by the BDFL's voice or vote by Guido van Rossum. So similar to Linus Torvalds in Linux. Now there's a steering committee. Obviously, things changed a little bit. But what I wanted to say was that when it came to what we do with the language, it was very important that he did not make a recommendation. He did that once when it came to web frameworks, because he said Django's going to be the dominating framework. That was at a time when the web framework landscape looked just as chaotic as the packaging landscape, and that gave Django the upper hand, by the way. And then it showed that he was working for Google, where Google App Engine supported Django, nothing else. So that was a coincidence, wasn't it? And so with packaging, there just seems to be in the culture that approach of let them fight it out and let's see who wins. And unfortunately, for an end user, for a developer, that doesn't help you if you have, I don't know what other languages, NPM, Brew, and what's that Forge thing? What is it, Rust? What does it use?
Honda
I
Forge?
can't remember them. I'm bad with names. But yeah, they all seem to settle on something, and you just know, I want this, I go this, that, and there it is, and not I have to choose how. And we're trying. I think it's getting there, but it's been a very long path.
Yeah, but it's been beneficial that PyProject TOML standard, I think, has helped quite a
Yeah,
bit.
but again, they didn't say which tool to use. They just it's
No,
just
but-
a, it's
no,
just
but
a
they made this-
It's just a metadata format
Right, yeah.
that gets laid down as a law, and then you fight it out who best deals with it.
Yeah. But as long as they had created that
Yes.
and the flexibility of it as well, that people could build off of it. I guess somehow more so than the setup.cfg, which didn't seem
Yeah.
to have picked up that much.
Well, that's the other difficulty is the separation of concerns. You know, this
Right.
setup when the setup tools. When you have the tool that talks to the packaging index, should probably better be from the same people as the packaging index. Then you know they're going to talk to each other well. As long as your interfaces, your API is not fully, transparently accessible to whatever tool, which wasn't the case. That's if both sides are still developing, and that seems to have solidified it.
The history as I remember it is a little bit different because the impression that I had was that Guido just really hated packaging. He really didn't care much about it, and like it didn't really get steering committee attention until the whole responsibility was kind of handed over to Alyssa Coughlin. The chaos thing is very interesting to me. Like, do you want us to shut up and like you continue?
No, go right ahead, because I was
Go to your 5 use cases there, because that was a fascinating list. Because the reason that's interesting is because 6 use cases. We've taken decades to sort of pin down that these are kind of roughly the things that most users of Python will want to do at some point. And they don't necessarily intuitively fit together, because managing dependencies in a development, the dependencies that a library might need if you're going to install a third-party library is considered to be a totally different problem to your virtual environment management or your versions of Python management. And so for a lot of years, you would have PyEnv that just did the one thing, and you had pip, which just did the installation of things, and then maybe you'd have something that it was only like tools like pipenv and poetry and UV now that like specifically got into the business of managing your virtual environment for you. Right. And the arguments between practitioners would be that those should be separate tools because they're very separate concerns. It kind of brings you back to the Linux philosophy, right? Of doing of a tool should do one thing and do it well.
I'm guessing that's that's lasted so long.
Yeah, and over time, yeah, like even poetry was one of the first tools I think that did your virtual environment management and your dependency management and the building of and uploading of packages to PyPI. And that was like, I think that was probably the first attempt at like an all-in-one tool.
Right.
And UV has run with that, yeah. But they were, the very rational argument for a long time was these are separate issues and they ought to be handled by separate tools.
Right.
You see, don't hate me, everybody, but I'm a Ruby programmer at core. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous for Ruby programmers, isn't it? And they started off with something which did the dependency management and libraries from the get-go, which was the gem
files.
Yes. Yeah. But what they didn't do is manage and install the executables. So having different versions of Ruby became a problem. And so there were then different people made different things: RBM, RVM. Even ASDF, which is a high-level thing, but does that in the box as well. And people argue all the time about which one to use, and it's fun to have the discussion. It's nice to have a favorite, but it's not necessarily productive. So I kind of like the way that Python is moving towards something unified, but even more the fact that there's that TOML file sitting there as a standardized way, which means I can actually change my tooling if I want, because I just have a preference. That does not exist in the case of moving between those different version managers. So each one is its own island and stores things in different places. And I think that's a really smart move.
It's fascinating to me what you just pointed out is that gem files have been around forever. And gem file lock files have been around forever. Yep. And Python only this week has finally pinned down a lock file format. Yeah. Like 25 years after Ruby did.
Good that you say Ruby, because I do want to point out that and this is why you see so many Rust tools. It's not because they're so fast. Because managing Python executables should not be done by something written in Python. And they just changed, and that principle took a while for people to catch on to. And it makes such a big difference. The first tool that was not written in Python got rid of all the problems you had when you yourself need Python executable to run. And I think that's why these latest ones are written in Rust. You put UV at the end of your evolutionary cycle, and I subscribe to that. So I don't know if people that do poetry or
well, that PDM seems to do everything, and from what I understand, it's
when it came out. But this is a one-person project.
Right, I've never used it, so I don't know.
It's awesome. I thought it was awesome.
Are you trying to indoctrinate us into using UV?
No, that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm trying to indoctrinate you just to follow the standards of the Pi project TOML. UV, I mean, you can. It seems really great.
I want to mention is that Rye, the last KiwiPyCon, there was a presentation. So all you need is Rye.
Right.
It's the same people. So Rye and UV are from the same. Rye is going to become just a thin wrapper to pass the hard work to UV. So, which is why at the moment there's still some feature There's no feature parity, but if you wanted to start tomorrow and you like this, go with UV straight away. There's 1 or 2 features you like in Rye that aren't in UV, they will be there. That makes any sense?
Well, yeah, and I
What
also
will, the developer itself said what will happen is, it doesn't say we're going to get rid of Rye, but it's basically just going to be passing stuff.
well, it seems like a similar thing that I've just recently read with PDM is that PDM has kind of decided to use the UV backend dependency resolver in PDM because it's just so much faster for them, I guess. and easier.
PDM is the single developer guy, right?
I guess. I don't know.
The story's not over yet.
Oh, no.
I think we're getting much closer.
Yeah, I feel like it's just
Far less
it's
frustrating.
narrowing. So
It used to be you have 5 options and all of them are frustrating in a different way. Now
exactly.
you've got 3 options and they're all pretty good in their own way.
Yeah, and well, they're all, and the APIs seem to be all pretty similar too. So
This time we've definitely got it entirely right.
definitely.
The only other thing I wanted to add about that history is that history does mix together a lot of things which are projects made by random people versus standards agreed upon by the Python steering committee. Those
Right.
are mixed together in that timeline.
Mhm.
And so it's not like, oh, Python said we should do this, and then Python said we should do this. Like, it is a mixture of tools. And,
Yeah.
and UV is controversial because it's written in Rust. You know, it's not chosen as the tool by anyone in particular.
No.
It's a pretty good tool, though. You should tell us about it.
Well, I can show you a little bit about it. So first, kind of the Pi project toml. So when you're creating a
Zoom in.
zoom in?
I think that's something in the settings of Visual Studio. I'm not sure.
Your other option if you're sharing the window is just to make the window not full screen and make it smaller, and then it will scale out.
Oh, you mean like make the window smaller and then just
Yeah.
like this?
Yeah, but you have to share the window, not the screen.
Should I do that?
Oh, no, okay.
Share the window.
Is that something else?
There you go.
Did that make it any better?
If I go in like File and then Preferences, in the top left corner. File, Preferences, Settings,
Someone on chat suggested Control Plus.
and
I'm
then
not
just
sure
do a search for font size or size.
Oh yeah, that did work actually. Oh. Oops, there we go. Oh, I just closed it. That's fantastic. Did that just? I wonder if that. Oh,
Yeah, I
go
could
back
see the
to
font
this.
size there. It was at 14. Maybe bump that up to 17 or 18 or so.
I could, that other thing seemed to work. Yeah, that seemed to work.
Oh, there we go. Beautiful.
Yeah, so generally when you're creating a project, ultimately just as a normal project, or you want to build a tool of some sort for Python, you probably go and create a repository in GitHub or your Git flavored online thing. And then ultimately you need to put a project toml in it. I normally just copy and paste an old PyProject toml so that I can use that as a template. A lot of those tools, including UV, will also just create a blank one for you, but I just copy and paste because I just use the same stuff over and over again. And this looks like this. You have a build system, and as I mentioned, Hatchling has become the new setup tools for building packages. So that's what's here. You probably don't have to worry about it if you're not building a package. And then it has all the project metadata that you'd want, refers to the README, and it has the requirements, the Python requirements, the Python version requirements, and this is the dependencies specifically just to run the script. And other things, this is a new option in here, dependency groups. This is to be able to say these are the extra dependencies I want for my development environment or my testing environment kind of thing. And then it has a bunch of other kind of tool specific other metadata stuff that can be appended onto it. They made it in a flexible way that, again, other poetry or other tools, Hatch or UV, can actually just add their own in a very standardized format if they have their own specific parameters that they want to assign to it. So there's nothing too complicated about this. I mean, the documentation is pretty good online that describe it, and usually once you have a template, you just copy and paste it anyway. You don't have to remember a lot of what's going on in it anyway, because ultimately then wow, get that bigger. That works ish too, not quite.
What are you using for the doing? Is it Putty or? What are you using for the terminal? Is it Putty or something else?
It's what's it called? Wake.
Wait.
Okay. Might crash something. Oh, that's fun. Well, I was going to show some. Oh. Okay. Why use the system? Whoa, that's
I
fine.
like that. That's
That'll
great.
do.
I can just take my glasses off.
Maybe something slightly smaller.
I think there was a keyboard shortcut for it.
I'm sure there would be.
That's good.
A little bit better. Good enough, I suppose. So this is me in that folder. And if we go to the UV page, the UV document page, it's good. It's pretty thorough. It's pretty good. I'd recommend looking at it. I'm not going to go through like everything about it. The documentation's pretty easy. But you can one line on the command line to install UV, whether it's Mac, Linux, or Windows, which is pretty nice. And yeah, and there's all sorts of other ways you can actually install it as well. Yeah, they even have Docker containers, official Docker containers, which is nice. And then yeah, the certain things that you can do is for example, if you want to install a specific version of Python, you can use, for example, this bit of code, and actually it shows up there before. It'll show all of the available Python versions that can be installed and the ones that are currently installed on your system. And you just have to go Python install that specific version as is shown here. Pretty straightforward, not too complicated. And as I had mentioned before, it can create projects and it can easily manage projects. You can do that via the command line. It has all the APIs associated with that, but I find it kind of nicer to just put it into the PyProject TOML just via code editor rather than having UV or Hatch or something like that do it. But it's got all the things you'd want in a modern package manager and project manager. And so once you have your PyProj toml with all your dependencies set up. So I've cleared this off completely. So there's nothing cached for when I'm installing the specific virtual environment for this. And when I do this, and I'll just do it right now, UV sync. So it actually just probably takes more time. Okay, so that's done. So it just installed all of the packages in the virtual environment specific to this PyProj toml that I just did, and it stores it in that directory as a .venv. That's the entire virtual environment, all set up in this directory. And so within it, you can work with it easily, like UV run, and then the script name will just run the script based on the environment that you've created. If you change the dependencies at all, and you just do UV run, it'll automatically know that something has changed, and it'll resync everything before it reruns it. Yeah, it's kind of magical on how fast it actually does it. I actually did it quicker than I thought it would. The internet must be pretty fast here. Yeah, and it also can do all the publishing of packages by just using UV build. And then you just go UV publish, and then it will ultimately publish just directly to PyP.
Do it.
No, I think this has probably already been published actually. But so it's just that easy, and I mean it has a lot of other fancy functionality, which is all kind of described here with other configuration. You can change where the caching location is, or where your virtual environments should go, and all sorts of fancy things. But yeah, for the most part, it just works pretty easily and without much effort. And again, from my experience in the past, especially with Conda, when you change your dependencies, it just takes it could take like 10 minutes for Conda in the past. Fortunately, they fixed that, but yeah, this becomes almost trivial now. Things that used to be quite hard to deal with have become trivial, actually, that you don't really have to worry. But does anybody have any other questions related to it?
Have you noticed any downsides so far? Anything that you miss about older, let's say package management, older tools, I suppose, since it covers everything?
Well, I guess it comes back to what was mentioned before about if you have separate tools to do that, then you can use it. You can use those separate tools for other things besides just this. And so, using this in managing your Python installations and that kind of stuff kind of forces you to primarily just use this. And if you have any other use cases, it can be kind of complicated. That's the only downside of one tool to rule them all, is that you have to use that tool, and you don't have other tools, parts of those other tools to do other things. But it's a hard sell when this thing is so effective, actually. So, but other people might have different opinions on that.
Yeah. So we moved pretty much our entire tool chain onto UV.
Oh.
Just every time we decide that we didn't go out and go, hey, big mission, let's change everything to UV. But pretty much every time we enter one of our major Python repos to start working on that particular area, one of the first things that will happen is it will get migrated to UV. And there's two reasons for that. One is when everything's consistent, it's better, all your developers know how to do the same thing, so you might as well get to that place. But the second thing is you really do get addicted to speed. Friction at Sharesies is a big deal. Developer friction is a big deal. We work really hard to try and minimize that, and having people sitting there not doing things because it's going to kick them out of the flow or spend some time that they don't want to be spending just twiddling their thumbs is a big deal. And so switching to something that's just so much faster with no real downsides for the kind of very mainstream basic stuff that we're doing. We're just managing a set of packages. There's not a lot of fancy stuff going on. It's pretty much a no-brainer. It did require that we figured out how to do it in the first place, and occasionally did some swearing. And then once we got over that hump that exists with every tool, then we were good. So yeah, really good experience here.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe take away some fear. You think, oh, what should I use? And if I use that, do I have to stick with that? What if the other one becomes the standard or gets better or so? It's actually not such a big step and such a big drive. I think that, and 1 year ago, you didn't have that choice. And this year now, 1 year later, at real life example of Sharesies, as you can see, they'll adopt. And quite fearlessly, because, you know, if I don't know, poetry comes tomorrow with a complete overhaul that wins on all that ticks all the boxes and is better and whatnot, then you can still change. It's not, as Richard said, there's some repos using this and some not. Okay, doesn't hurt. So you can make that choice anytime, and you can revise it. It's not forever, really. The standard of that PyProject.toml is the important part. That's standardized, and that's now there. Both of the tools I mentioned use them. Now with some minor flavoring put on top.
I assume it can ingest Conda YAML files and that kind of thing to build an environment.
I don't think it can handle the Conda files.
The-
It wouldn't be able to, because Conda, I mean, that's not in PyPy. Their
No, the YAML.
Their index is a completely separate catalog.
No, the YAML, which is you can export an environment, just says all the versions of.
I know, but those are all in the Conda ecosystem.
Oh,
Those are
Conda
not in
forward.
Those are not in PyPy.
So it can, right.
As far as I understand, this is all this has to be
A lot of them
in
are
PyPy.
standard Python packages, though.
Well, they publish them in
Some are
both.
differently though.
Yeah.
So they
Right,
published in
okay.
both, because I do it myself. I publish it in PyPy, and then I sometimes
Right.
publish it in Conda.
Yeah.
But they're completely independent, separate things.
UV, you are using a pip blessed standard file, and you're talking to the PSF-backed Python packaging index.
Right.
So it's not like you're putting your money on any like weird horse coming from the side.
Right.
What did Sharesies use before UV?
Well, so we've been around for 8 years this year, and in that time we've used 3 different Python package managers. We, I think, started with pip, we moved to Poetry, then we moved more recently to UV. So yeah, and in terms of like worrying, look, yes, it's great that they're all going to use the same standard files, but in the end, it's just a big long list of packages with version numbers attached to that. This is not a dramatic change no matter what you do.
There was pip compile in there as well, Richard.
Oh, good. Apparently we had
Except compile
four.
poetry
So
to UV.
if you're feeling scared about this, or I tell you what, if you go to use UV, you start picking up UV and you just really dislike it, I think one of the things you can take heart in is within 2 years, there'll be a new one. And, that'll be different.
And you'll get your money back.
What are you talking about? UV will definitely be the last one. We've perfected it.
Was there any hard gotchas from moving to UV? Because it sounds like there's been quite a few projects so far.
No, our migration was very, very smooth. I attribute that partly because the space has evolved, right, and everybody's got the basics of how this stuff should work. The other reason I attribute it is because mostly it was Martin, the other technical director at Sharesies, who was driving it. He's just really good at this stuff. So yeah, he probably ate a pile of pain that nobody else ever saw.
Anybody else?
The concern that some people in the community have about UV and Rough and that suite of tools is that, kind of like the Docker ecosystem, it's they're open source projects that are basically built by one company that is supported by venture capital injections, and at some point, the money's going to run out, and either the money's going to run out or they're going to need to find a way to productize it. But they're open source tools. So one way or another, the tools as they currently exist will stand. But we've seen that same cycle with Docker, where Docker created a new technology that really did change the way a lot of us run in the industry, and then is rapidly losing market share because the venture capital ran out, and generally speaking, people have started migrating to open source platforms inspired by Docker. They had everything for a while, and then ... came before profit, and that's where it all started to fall apart. So people are a little bit worried about a lot of the eggs of the Python infrastructure going into the one basket of a couple really nice tools that are all kind of built by a company that doesn't necessarily have much in the way of a guaranteed revenue stream.
Yeah, but some people always have a problem. It's free software. They go broke, we fork.
Right.
End of
Exactly.
story.
That's how it works.
Well, no, like
Programmers, not Rust.
it's worth thinking about the systemic fallback from that, because that's not end of story.
Well, yeah, but it's also not like they
and-
have 20 people there. Unfortunately, you will have to find Rust developers
Yeah.
in the Python community.
Yeah, and that's
And then
exactly.
after it,
Yeah, so if particularly key parts of the Python infrastructure become very dependent on a smaller skill set, because the Rust skill set is in the Python community by definition smaller than the Python skill set in the Python community. Yeah, there's medium-term issues there that will be interesting to see how they play out, but they're not existential threats, of course.
And I imagine that if you've moved to UV, and then later on, UV becomes not sustainable and you have to move to something else, the standardization because of the TOML file will make it a pretty easy leap to whatever comes next.
It'll just be slower.
Yeah.
Mm.
you're
No
not
more
really
Rust.
dependent on that tool, you depend on that standard.
Right.
Like the repo that you pull from is going to look exactly the same. Maybe the log file, but we've solved that now.
Yeah, what you're really dependent on is PyPI. And that's the one where the money really can't afford to run out.
Sounds good. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay.